Hi, I'm Dr. Altaf, and today I want to talk about something that I think deserves a lot more honest conversation than it usually gets. We talk about cancer as though it's almost entirely a matter of fate. Either you inherited the wrong genes or you were unlucky. And yes, genetics and chance do play a real role. About 40% of us will receive a cancer diagnosis at some point in our lives, and that statistic alone is sobering enough to sit with for a moment. But here's what the research also tells us, and I think this is genuinely hopeful. Studies suggest that somewhere between 40 and 57% of cancers may actually be preventable. Not by magic, not by any single superfood, but by the cumulative daily choices we make, and particularly by what we eat. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is a topic where a lot of well-meaning health content gets it very wrong. It either goes too far in one direction, telling you that food causes cancer, or it dismisses diet entirely as irrelevant. The truth, as it usually is, lives somewhere in between. And that's where I want to take you today. What we're really talking about is the internal environment of your body. Cancer isn't only a genetic disease. Research increasingly frames it as a metabolic disease, an inflammatory disease, and in many ways, an environmental disease. The conditions inside your body, your hormone levels, your degree of chronic inflammation, the health of your gut, all of these shape how hospitable or inhospitable your body is to abnormal cell growth. And certain foods, including some that seem completely ordinary, can quietly shift that environment in the wrong direction. So in this video, I want to walk you through the main dietary patterns and food categories that the research has connected to cancer risk. I'll explain the biology clearly. I'll be upfront about where the evidence is strong and where it's still evolving. And I'll give you a practical framework at the end that you can actually use without turning mealtimes into an anxiety spiral. Let's start with one of the most significant and underestimated categories, and that's sugar-sweetened beverages. Now, most of us already know that sodas aren't exactly health food, but the category is wider than people realize. It includes energy drinks, sweetened iced teas, flavored coffees, boba teas, and yes, even certain fruit juices. These drinks have one thing in common. They deliver very large amounts of sugar into your bloodstream extremely quickly, with almost nothing to slow that absorption down. No fiber, no protein, just a rapid, concentrated sugar load. Large population studies have found associations between regular consumption of these drinks and increased risk for several cancers, including colorectal cancer, liver cancer, and some pancreatic cancers. And when you look at the biology, there's a plausible explanation for why. It comes down to something called the Warburg effect, which is one of the more fascinating and well-documented features of cancer cell metabolism. Most healthy cells generate energy efficiently, using oxygen to extract large amounts of energy from the nutrients they consume. Cancer cells often behave very differently. Many of them switch to a fast, inefficient pathway where they burn through glucose at a remarkably high rate, even when oxygen is available. It's as though they've got an engine running at full throttle all the time, and their preferred fuel is glucose. Now layer on top of that what happens hormonally when we consume large amounts of sugar. Our bodies release insulin and a related hormone called IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor 1, in response. These hormones are critical for regulating blood sugar, but they also act as cellular growth signals. They tell cells to grow, to divide, to store energy. And when insulin levels remain chronically elevated over months and years, a state we call hyperinsulinemia, the body is essentially bathing all of its cells in growth-promoting signals. If there are any abnormal cells in that environment, those signals may help accelerate their development. This is why liquid sugar is particularly worth paying attention to. It produces some of the most rapid and dramatic blood sugar and insulin spikes of any dietary source. One thing worth mentioning in this context, and that I want to address carefully, is the question of arsenic contamination in some fruit juices, particularly apple juice. Inorganic arsenic is classified as a known carcinogen, and trace levels have been detected in some fruit juices and in rice. Regulatory agencies like the FDA do monitor for this, and action levels exist. For most people consuming moderate amounts, the risk is low. But if fruit juice is a daily staple, it's a reasonable thing to be aware of, and moderation is sensible. For rice specifically, soaking it overnight and rinsing thoroughly before cooking has been shown to meaningfully reduce arsenic content if this is something you'd like to minimize. But liquid sugar is really just one piece of a larger and more pervasive dietary pattern, and that pattern is the rise of ultra-processed foods. Ultra-processed foods are products made primarily from refined, industrially derived ingredients rather than whole foods. We're talking about packaged snacks, fast food, most commercial breakfast cereals, many frozen ready meals, and processed desserts. These foods are designed, and I use that word deliberately, to be extremely palatable, convenient, and inexpensive. And they are extraordinarily successful at being all three of those things. Large observational studies, including research involving hundreds of thousands of participants followed over many years, have found associations between high ultra-processed food intake and elevated cancer risk. One major study found that for every 10% increase in ultra-processed food consumption, overall cancer risk was associated with a 13% increase and colorectal cancer risk with a 30% increase. Now, I want to be clear about what association means in this context, because I think it matters enormously. These studies can't prove causation the way a controlled clinical trial can. People who eat more ultra-processed foods may differ from people who don't in dozens of other ways: activity level, stress, income, access to healthcare, overall diet quality. Researchers do their best to account for these factors, but they can't eliminate them entirely. So these numbers tell us there's a meaningful signal worth paying attention to. Not that ultra-processed food directly causes cancer in any simple linear way. That said, the biological mechanisms are real and well established. Ultra-processed foods tend to drive rapid blood sugar spikes, feeding that insulin signaling environment we discussed. They promote chronic low-grade inflammation, a state now recognized as a contributing factor in multiple cancers. They often contain additives like certain emulsifiers that can disrupt the gut microbiome, damage the intestinal lining, and worsen systemic inflammation. And perhaps most importantly, they crowd out the protective foods we should be eating instead: the fiber-rich vegetables, legumes, and whole grains that actively support immune function and cellular health. It's that last point I want you to hold on to. The problem isn't just what ultra-processed foods contain, it's what they replace. Now let's talk about another food category that often gets overlooked in Western conversations about cancer risk, and that's heavily salted and preserved foods. Salt-preserved foods have long been associated with higher rates of stomach cancer, particularly in regions where these foods are dietary staples. High salt concentrations can irritate and damage the lining of the stomach over time, promoting chronic inflammation that makes the stomach tissue more vulnerable to carcinogenic compounds. Some preserved meats also contain nitrosamines, compounds formed during the curing process that are known to damage DNA. Research suggests that people with consistently high salt intake may have meaningfully elevated risk for gastric cancer compared to those with lower intake. This doesn't mean you need to avoid all salt or all cured foods. Context and quantity matter enormously, but if preserved, heavily salted foods are a significant feature of your regular diet, it's worth discussing with your doctor, particularly if you have any other gastric risk factors. Now I want to spend some time on what I think is the most genuinely nuanced area of this conversation, and that's processed meat and unprocessed red meat. These two categories get lumped together constantly, but the science treats them very differently, and so should we. Let's start with processed meat, because the evidence here is actually fairly clear, and it comes from a respected international body. The International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is part of the World Health Organization, classifies processed meats as a Group 1 carcinogen. Group 1 means there is sufficient evidence of carcinogenicity in humans. The foods we're talking about include bacon, sausages, hot dogs, salami, and deli meats. The most well-established link is with colorectal cancer, though associations with other cancers have also been noted. The biological mechanism is reasonably well understood. Processed meats typically contain nitrites and nitrates, used for curing and preservation. When these compounds enter the acidic environment of the stomach, they can form nitrosamines, compounds that can damage DNA. DNA damage, when it accumulates and isn't repaired properly, is one of the foundational steps in cancer development. Does this mean you should never eat a rasher of bacon again? I'm not going to tell you that, because the honest answer is that the research looks at habitual, regular consumption, not the occasional meal. But if processed meats are a daily feature of your diet, the evidence is strong enough that reducing that frequency is a reasonable and science-supported decision. Unprocessed red meat is a different story, and a more complicated one. Red meat meat, beef, lamb, pork, is classified as a Group 2A carcinogen by the same body. Group 2A means it's probably carcinogenic to humans. The distinction from Group 1 matters. It reflects more limited direct human evidence, even though the biological mechanisms are plausible. Now, there's genuine scientific debate here, and I want to be honest with you about it. A major review published in the Annals of Internal Medicine in 2019 concluded that reducing red meat intake had only small health effects based on the existing evidence, and suggested that adults could reasonably continue their current intake. This sparked significant controversy because the American Cancer Society and other bodies have pointed out that the review placed very little weight on large observational studies, which are the primary source of long-term dietary evidence in humans. And here's the thing about nutritional research that I think is worth understanding clearly, because it actually makes you a better reader of health information generally. Randomized controlled trials, where you assign people to specific diets and control variables, give you stronger cause and effect data. But for cancer, which can take decades to develop, running a controlled trial long enough to measure cancer outcomes is essentially impossible. You'd need to control what people eat for 20 or 30 years, with perfect adherence. That's not realistic. So observational studies, following large populations over long periods and looking for patterns, are the main tool we have. These give us real-world data at meaningful timescales, but they can't fully eliminate confounding variables. Researchers do adjust for these, but some uncertainty always remains. So when you see headlines confidently claiming red meat causes or doesn't cause cancer, what's really happening is different researchers weighting these two types of evidence differently. That's not bad science. It's an honest reflection of the complexity involved. My read of the evidence is this: regular high consumption of red meat, particularly several times a day, every day, likely does create a dietary environment that increases colorectal cancer risk over time. But 1 or 2 servings per week, particularly when the rest of the diet is fiber-rich and varied, is probably not a major independent risk factor for most people. Moderation and context matter far more than the question of whether to eat red meat at all. One particularly interesting piece of research supports this contextual view. A study published in the British Journal of Nutrition had participants consume a significant daily amount of red meat and found that this increased a biomarker associated with DNA damage in the colon. But when researchers added resistant starch, a type of fermentable fiber found in foods like potatoes, legumes, and green bananas, that marker returned to baseline. The DNA damage signal essentially disappeared. This was a single mechanistic study, so we shouldn't overinterpret it, but it points to something important. The overall dietary environment surrounding any one food matters. Red meat as part of a fiber-depleted diet is a very different metabolic context than red meat as part of a fiber-rich diet. This leads me to fiber, which deserves to be named here as one of the most consistently supported protective dietary factors for colorectal cancer across many different types of research. Fiber feeds the beneficial bacteria in your gut, which in turn produce short-chain fatty acids like butyrate. Butyrate directly nourishes the cells lining your colon, reduces inflammation, and may help regulate abnormal cell growth. If the broader dietary pattern around red meat is displacing fiber-rich foods, that's where a significant part of the risk increase likely comes from. There's one more factor I want to mention on the meat question, and that's cooking method. When meat, any meat, is cooked at very high temperatures through grilling, frying, or barbecuing, particularly when it chars or burns, it can form compounds called heterocyclic amines and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. Both of these compound classes have been shown to cause DNA damage in laboratory studies, and both are classified as probable carcinogens. You can reduce this meaningfully. Pre-cooking meat before finishing it on a grill reduces the time it spends over high heat. Marinating with herbs, garlic, onions, or vinegar has been shown in some studies to reduce the formation of these compounds. Choosing leaner cuts produces less fat dripping and less smoke, which carries these compounds back onto the meat. And avoiding sugary marinades, which char quickly, is a simple, practical change. None of this means grilling is off the table. It means how you prepare food is part of the picture, not just what the food is. So let me bring this together into a practical framework you can actually use. The goal isn't perfection. It isn't eliminating entire food groups or building your life around cancer anxiety. The goal is shifting your overall dietary environment in a direction that's less hospitable to chronic disease over the long run. That's a realistic, sustainable ambition. First, reduce sugar-sweetened beverages. This is probably the single highest impact change most people can make relative to effort. Water, sparkling water, water, unsweetened tea, and black coffee are all fine alternatives. If fruit juice is a regular habit, treat it as an occasional drink rather than a daily staple, and favor whole fruit when you can. Second, push ultra-processed foods toward the edges of your diet rather than the center. You don't need to eliminate them entirely. Restriction thinking often backfires, but if the majority of what you eat in a day comes from packages designed to be eaten without cooking, that's worth addressing. More whole foods, more often. That doesn't require expense or complexity. Third, think about processed meat frequency. Occasional is different from daily. If processed meats are a regular part of your breakfasts, lunches, and snacks, reducing that frequency to a few times a week is a meaningful, evidence-supported step. Fourth, build fiber in. Vegetables, legumes, whole grains, nuts, seeds, these aren't just neutral additions to your diet. They actively create a gut environment that works against cancer development. If your plate currently has very little of these, adding more is probably the most broadly protective dietary change you can make. Fifth, think about how you cook. Lower and slower when you can. Marinate. Go easy on the char. And finally, please talk to your doctor. If you have a family history of any cancer, if you're over 50, or if you have any symptoms that concern you, a conversation with your physician is irreplaceable. This kind of education is valuable, but it works alongside medical care, not instead of it. Cancer risk is genuinely complex, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. What we know is that the daily choices we make, repeated thousands of times over years and decades, do shape the internal environment of our bodies. That's both a sobering thought and, I think, a genuinely empowering one. If this kind of honest, evidence-based health information is useful to you, I'd love for you to subscribe to this channel. I put these videos out so that you have access to the clearest, most accurate picture of what the science actually says. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.